Have you ever questioned why you're told that being single is a problem to be fixed, that your worth is somehow incomplete, unproven, unworthy, until someone else chooses you? Maybe you've been made to feel like your freedom is just loneliness in disguise, like your silence is a failure, like your lack of romantic attention is some cosmic punishment, or worse, a sign that you're broken. But what if I told you something dangerous, something liberating, that everything they've taught you about love, about success, about masculinity might be a lie, that what you call emptiness might actually be space, space for truth, space for sovereignty, space for the kind of power that doesn't beg to be seen. Because Epicurus, the philosopher most people wrongly reduce to pleasure and gardens, understood something society still refuses to accept, that freedom begins when you stop asking to be desired, that the man who learns to enjoy solitude becomes untouchable, not because he's cold, but because he no longer confuses attention with meaning. And maybe that's what they fear, a man who doesn't need their approval, a man who isn't shaped by someone else's gaze. See, most of what you've been told about being a man centers around performance. Perform well enough, love hard enough, earn high enough, and maybe, just maybe, you'll be worthy of being chosen. That's the hidden curriculum, isn't it? Work yourself to death for attention, numb your feelings to seem confident, learn to tolerate emotional crumbs, because at least it means you're not alone. But Epicurus looked at that entire machine and said, no. He said pleasure isn't about indulgence, it's about peace, about the absence of disturbance. He believed that to be free, a man must free himself not from struggle, but from illusion, especially the illusion that your happiness lies in someone else's hands. That illusion is the real prison. That illusion is what keeps you chasing, performing, breaking yourself just to be liked. And the more you chase it, the further from yourself you drift. So let me ask you directly, when did you start believing that being loved by someone else made you more real, that you weren't a full man until you were chosen, posted, praised? It's not your fault this belief was fed to you, in movies, in songs, in the way people ask, why are you still single? As if that's code for what's wrong with you. And after hearing it enough times, you start to internalize it, you start to confuse longing with lack. You start to feel ashamed of your own stillness, as if being okay by yourself is something you need to explain. But Epicurus, he flipped that script completely. He said the wise man seeks not the love of the many, but freedom from needing it at all. He spoke of ataraxia, tranquility of the soul, as the ultimate goal. Not achievement, not seduction, not being known, followed, or envied, just peace. Imagine that. A philosophy where the highest victory is simply no longer being disturbed by what you cannot control. If you think that sounds weak, think again, because there's nothing harder than breaking the addiction to external validation. It's easy to chase someone's approval. It's easy to keep checking your phone, waiting for that text that makes you feel wanted. It's easy to keep shaping yourself into what others want, just to avoid the terror of your own reflection. What's hard is silence. What's hard is sitting with yourself without the noise and asking, who am I when no one is watching? That's the fire Epicurus walked into, and that's the fire most men avoid. You've been taught to seek meaning in being chosen, but what if meaning lives in the choice to stand alone, to stop performing, to stop negotiating your worth, to stop hoping that love will save you from yourself? And this is the dark truth no one wants to admit. Most of what you've been calling love has been dependency wearing a nicer mask. Most of the connection you've sought has been about escape, not union. You weren't looking to be seen, you were looking to disappear into someone else's idea of who you should be. And when it ended, you didn't just lose them, you lost the version of yourself that only existed through their approval. Epicurus warned against this. He said, attachment to what you cannot control is suffering, and if you've ever sat alone in a room, wondering why you weren't enough for someone who left, you felt that suffering. You've tasted the bitterness of tying your identity to someone else's eyes. But what if that pain wasn't rejection? What if it was the beginning of liberation? Because here's the secret: when you stop chasing validation, the whole world starts to reorganize around you. The energy shifts. Not because you've become cold or numb, but because you've stopped leaking your power into places that don't honor it. You've stopped bleeding for love. You've started building something inside you that no one can take away. And that kind of man, he doesn't beg. He doesn't explain. He doesn't wait to be chosen, because he already chose himself. Now I want you to sit with this, not just as an idea, but as a confrontation. How much of your life has been shaped by the need to be desired? How many choices have you made, not because you wanted them, but because you thought they'd make someone else want you more? And what have those choices cost you? The man who walks the Epicurean path isn't hiding from love, he's redefining it. He's saying, I will not mistake emotional highs for self-worth. I will not trade my peace for temporary closeness. I will not abandon myself just to be seen. And when a man truly starts living like that, he becomes immune to the games, immune to the pressure, immune to the panic that says you're running out of time, you need to be with someone now. He's no longer running, he's building, quietly, relentlessly, from within. But here's what makes this transformation so disorienting for others. When you stop needing them to see you, they start wondering if they ever really saw you at all. And they didn't. Not the real you. They saw a version of you molded by your need to be accepted, your willingness to be soft where you should have been steel, quiet where you should have been bold. So when you shift, when you stop performing, stop responding, stop accommodating, the illusion collapses, and some people will resent you for that, not because you hurt them, but because you stopped letting them use you to avoid themselves. Epicurus taught that a man must cultivate a kind of indifference, not coldness, not cruelty, but a quiet refusal to let external things decide your inner weather. That's the art. The internal stance that says, I no longer negotiate my peace. If someone stays, fine. If they leave, also fine. Because my life doesn't orbit around being chosen, it orbits around clarity. And here's what happens when you build your world on clarity. People start to show themselves. Some will disappear. Some will challenge you. Some will accuse you of being distant, hard, or arrogant. But all they're really saying is, I don't know how to control you anymore. And to that you say, exactly. Now let's talk about solitude, because that word has been weaponized. They've told you solitude is the same as failure, that if you're alone too long, something must be wrong with you, that independence is just a cover for brokenness. But Epicurus knew the opposite. He understood that solitude isn't the absence of love, it's the foundation of it. If you can't sit with yourself in silence, you will never know what you actually want. You'll mistake loneliness for longing. You'll settle for noise just to drown out your own disconnection. Solitude is not a punishment. It's a mirror. And what you see in that mirror, what you finally face when the distractions fade, that's your raw material. That's where the building begins. Because there's a moment in every man's life when he has to choose. Be the man the world wants, or become the man he actually is. And that choice always begins in silence, in walking alone, in refusing to be entertained out of your own becoming. Most people avoid this stage. They distract themselves with validation loops. Dating apps, flings, casual attention, just enough to stay afloat, just enough to avoid looking in the mirror. But if you're watching this, it means that part of you is ready to stop floating. You're ready to sink, not into despair, but into depth. You're tired of living in the shallow end, tired of loving like a performance, tired of carrying your value like something to be proven. You want something real, something earned, something unshakable. That doesn't come through chasing, it comes through withdrawing. Not in bitterness, not in defeat, but in intentional silence. Epicurus would say, you don't need less solitude, you need more of it. Not as a retreat from life, but as a return to yourself. You've given so much of your energy to being seen that you forgot what it feels like to truly see. To see your own patterns, your own cravings, your own triggers. And until you understand what you're looking for in others, you will keep giving your power to people who don't know what to do with it. Detachment doesn't mean you stop caring. It means you stop controlling. It means you finally accept that some people will never understand you, and that's not your problem. Some will never love you the way you want, and that's not a flaw. Some will reject you simply because you refuse to be small, and that's a compliment. The more you detach, the more you realize that most of your suffering came from false expectations that someone else should complete you, should save you, should make you feel like enough. Epicurus would laugh at that, not cruelly but knowingly, because he knew that the only way to peace is through relinquishing the fantasy of rescue. And here's where things get radical. When you no longer need anyone to make you feel whole, you start showing up differently. You don't chase, you don't over-explain, you don't try to impress. You become the man who listens more than he speaks, who chooses solitude not as a fallback but as a standard, who doesn't mistake a warm body for a meaningful bond, and suddenly, the people who once overlooked you now feel drawn to your silence, not because you're louder, but because you're rooted. And being rooted is dangerous in a world that thrives on emotional chaos. You no longer flinch at silence. You no longer panic at distance. You no longer interpret someone's absence as proof of your inadequacy. You understand that everyone moves based on their own wounds, and most people aren't even aware of theirs. So you stop taking everything personally. You stop internalizing rejection. You stop bending to be seen. There's this shift that happens deep inside when you stop asking, "Why don't they want me?" and start asking, "Why did I ever need them to?" That question, that's your emancipation. That's when you reclaim the power you've been scattering in all directions, the power to choose your own direction, to define your own worth, to walk away not because you're bitter, but because you're done pretending that half love is enough. Epicurus understood that a man who controls his mind is more powerful than one who controls empires, because the empire of the self is where all wars begin and end. When you win that war, you stop living in reaction. You start living in response, and your response becomes sacred, measured, aligned. You no longer act to be liked, you act to be true. You no longer move to gain, you move to express. And that expression? That's where real power lives, not in domination, not in submission, but in sovereignty. So yes, you may be single, you may even be alone, but you are not lacking. You are not in waiting. You are not half of something looking for the other half. You are whole. You are learning, finally, that solitude is not a gap to be filled, it is a fire to be walked through. And when you walk through it, what emerges on the other side is not a more desirable man, it's a man who desires differently. A man who is no longer for sale, a man who no longer performs, a man who no longer fears his own silence. Mad? That terrifies the world. You become a threat the moment you stop needing to be rescued. Not because you're aggressive, not because you've become hardened or hostile, but because the entire system that thrives on your emotional dependency suddenly malfunctions. You stop feeding it. You no longer bite the bait. The dating culture, the attention economy, the performance-based worth metrics, they all begin to collapse around you, not externally, internally. And when that collapse happens, you feel it first as loneliness. But it's not loneliness, it's withdrawal, a psychological detox. You're weaning off a lifetime of looking outward for inward answers. You're unlearning the belief that you need to be validated, affirmed, or adored in order to feel alive. And that unlearning process, it's brutal, it's disorienting, but it's also the first sign of liberation. When Epicurus spoke about pleasure, he wasn't talking about indulgence. He wasn't talking about escaping responsibility or numbing yourself to reality. He was talking about the kind of inner stability that makes you ungovernable by the noise of others. And nothing disturbs modern people more than someone who doesn't need what they've been told to chase. You've seen it, the discomfort people feel when you no longer play by the script, when you no longer panic over ghosting, when you stop rushing into relationships, when you stop explaining why you're not chasing after what everyone else is chasing. They don't know what to do with that kind of man because they can't manipulate him, they can't sell to him, they can't scare him into settling for less. They can only observe and often resent his calm. That calm is cultivated in the crucible of solitude, not the curated Instagram solitude, but the real thing, the kind where you sit in silence and the distractions fade and the thoughts begin to rise, the kind where your regrets show up and stare you in the face, the kind where your insecurities speak louder than ever, and you don't run from them this time. You listen. You let them say what they need to say, and then you keep going. You learn to carry your own chaos without projecting it onto others. You stop needing someone else to hold your pain just so you can feel seen. You become the holder, the fire keeper, the architect of your own peace. And when that happens, your entire posture toward love changes. You no longer seek connection as a way to complete yourself. You seek it as a space to share what's already complete. You're not begging to be chosen. You're watching to see who chooses themselves first. You're not seduced by potential anymore. You're looking for patterns, for accountability, for inner work. You're not impressed by aesthetic. You're tuned into resonance, emotional depth, intellectual stillness. You don't want to be saved. You want to be met. But only someone who has faced themselves can meet you like that. That's the kind of love Epicurus would respect, if he respected romantic love at all, which he mostly didn't. Not because he was bitter, but because he saw how quickly desire becomes dependency and how easily dependency becomes distortion. He warned that emotional attachment, rooted in fear, fear of being alone, fear of not being enough, fear of being forgotten, inevitably leads to suffering. So he chose a different path, a path where relationships, if they existed, were chosen not out of emptiness, but from abundance. Not because he needed someone to heal him, but because peace, when shared, multiplies. And this is where your mindset starts to shift. You no longer think of love as a savior, you think of it as a mirror. And if that mirror reflects back your old patterns, your unresolved wounds, your need to be needed, you step back, not in anger, in awareness, because you know now that not every connection is healing. Some are distractions, some are detours, some are tests, and your peace is not worth gambling just to feel temporarily wanted. You've gone too far into yourself to turn back now. You've seen the truth. And once you've seen it, you can't unsee it. You've seen how being single doesn't mean being lost. It means being unavailable for dysfunction. It means being willing to wait until it's real, or to walk alone forever rather than settle for a mask. It means recognizing that most people aren't looking for love, they're looking for anesthesia. And you're done being someone's painkiller. You're done performing stability for people who... You're done selling yourself short just to not feel alone on a Friday night. And let's be honest, there are moments when this road feels brutal, when your phone is quiet, when the world feels distant, when you wonder if this sovereignty you've fought for is worth the solitude it demands. But then you remember, peace has a price, and that price is discomfort. That price is letting go of what you thought you needed. That price is being willing to be misunderstood, misjudged and mislabeled as cold, just so you can be free. Because freedom doesn't always feel like happiness. Sometimes it feels like emptiness, like space, like loss. But it's not loss. It's clearing away the noise, clearing away the roles, clearing away the false urgency to prove yourself through someone else's approval. And when the clearing is complete, something else emerges. Not a version of you built for acceptance, but a version built for truth, rooted, quiet, clear. The man you become on the other side of detachment isn't less emotional, he's more honest. He doesn't pretend not to feel. He just stops outsourcing his feelings to people who don't deserve access to them. He doesn't hide his depth. He just stops performing it for those who are swimming in the shallow end. He doesn't stop believing in love. He just stops believing that love should cost his peace. And this man, he's rare, because most will trade their inner world for outer comfort. Most will compromise just to not feel the sting of solitude. Most will stay in patterns they've outgrown just to avoid the awkwardness of facing themselves. But not you, not anymore. You've crossed the line now. You've glimpsed a version of yourself that's no longer starving for attention. You've tasted the power that comes from not reacting, from not chasing, from not folding just to be liked. You're not incomplete. You're not behind. You're not broken because you're single. You're sovereign. You're building something real. And that kind of power, it can't be bought. It can't be borrowed. It can only be built. Alone. In silence. In truth. At some point, the world starts to feel quieter. Not because it's changed, but because you've stopped tuning in to every demand it places on you. You stop reacting to the looks, the questions, the subtle pity people offer when they realize you're not chasing the same things they are. You stop defending your path to those who've never had the courage to walk alone. You stop craving explanation, because the longer you walk this road, the clearer it becomes. You don't need to be understood to be valid. You don't need agreement to be aligned. And you don't need applause to know you're doing the right thing. That's the power Epicurus was pointing to. A man anchored in his own internal world becomes immune to the chaos of others. He doesn't shut down, he doesn't disconnect, he simply chooses what is allowed into his sphere, because not every opinion deserves entry, not every energy gets access. This is the overlooked wisdom of detachment. It's not about cutting yourself off from life. It's about finally deciding what kind of life you're willing to participate in. You stop overextending your emotional credit line. You stop co-signing dysfunction out of habit. You stop showing up for people who don't show up for themselves. Because you've learned that your presence is valuable, and just because you're capable of healing doesn't mean you have to keep being someone's emotional nerve. You've paid your dues, you've earned your silence, now you move from a place of choice, not compulsion. There's a profound shift that happens when you realize you're no longer living to escape aloneness, but to protect your peace. When you realize that silence isn't the enemy, that it doesn't mean you're unloved, unworthy, or forgotten. It means you're in the space between destruction and creation, and in that space you begin to build a new kind of foundation. A quieter one, a deeper one not based on who likes you, needs you, or keeps you around out of convenience, but on who respects your wholeness. And often in that phase, very few remain, but the ones who do, those are your tribe. Not because they complete you, but because they don't ask you to be incomplete to be with them. Most people are terrified of losing connection. That fear makes them cling, it makes them tolerate, it makes them accept almost anything just to not be alone. But the Epicurean man, the man who's tasted real solitude, he has a different fear. He fears losing himself. He fears self-abandonment. He fears the slow erosion of his soul in the name of being liked. And that fear becomes his boundary. That fear becomes his discernment, because he's walked the valley, he's sat in the darkness, he's cried without witnesses, and he's learned that the only thing worse than being alone is pretending just to avoid it. That's the beauty of choosing aloneness. You find out what's real about yourself, about others, about the difference between love and addiction, between attention and intimacy, between approval and actual presence. And you stop giving yourself away for free. You stop over-explaining your standards. You stop dimming your light so others don't feel inadequate. You let go of the savior role. You stop fixing. You start observing. You notice who's doing the work, who's just talking, who's asking for your energy versus who's offering theirs. And you no longer beg for anything. Not love, not clarity, not closure, not respect. If it's not given freely, it's not accepted. That's the rule. Because begging may win you a place in someone's life, but it'll never win you a place in their heart, and more importantly, it'll cost you your dignity. That dignity, that quiet inner knowing that you are enough even in your solitude, is what Epicurus wanted men to protect. It's what makes you powerful beyond measure, not because you're feared, but because you cannot be owned. You may start to see how most systems in society thrive on the emotional hunger of men. Advertising, dating culture, social media, they all operate by whispering to your inadequacies. They all depend on your willingness to shapeshift, to seek, to chase, to prove. But when you unplug from that matrix, everything slows down. The noise quiets. You stop being a consumer. You become a creator of thought, of intention, of your own standards. And that shift? That's when people start calling you changed or different or too serious. But what they really mean is this: you stopped making yourself available for the game. And they don't know what to do with someone who won't play by their rules. Epicurus never wanted men to become isolated cynics. He wanted them to become sovereign beings, able to choose wisely, love freely, and let go easily, to build their joy on what is within their control, to understand that true friendship, true love, true connection, those are bonuses, not blueprints. They're sacred, but they're not oxygen. And if you treat them like oxygen, you will suffocate, you will cling, you will compromise, and you will lose yourself in the name of being loved. But you've come too far for that now. You've tasted the clarity that only silence can give. You've sat with your own ghosts long enough to recognize who belongs and who doesn't. You've cried not because someone left, but because you finally returned to yourself. And that return is what makes you dangerous in all the right ways. Because you're not chasing, you're not convincing, you're not performing, you are simply standing in your truth. And most people aren't used to that kind of energy. So yes, people will say you're intimidating, that you're too much, too distant, too aware. Let them. You've traded being understood for being aligned. You've traded being liked for being respected. You've chosen the long game, the slow burn, the deep roots. And in a world drunk on instant gratification and performative connection, that makes you a heretic. Good. Be the heretic. Be the man who doesn't flinch when someone leaves. Be the man who values his peace more than a warm body next to him. Be the man who knows that not all company is companionship. You're not difficult, you're discerning. You're not cold, you're clear. You're not unlovable, you're just unwilling to be loved conditionally. And the moment you fully accept that, something shifts. You stop waiting for someone to see you, because you've already seen yourself. When you see yourself, really see yourself, not as an object to be improved or fixed, but as a whole breathing, sovereign being, everything changes. You don't just attract differently, you perceive differently. The same situations, the same people, the same temptations, they no longer grip you the same way. You're not waiting for someone to complete your story. You're writing it alone, not because you gave up, but because you finally started. And there's a weight to that, a sacred kind of responsibility. You become accountable to your own freedom. You know that every yes and every no you give either builds or breaks your sovereignty, and so you choose carefully who you speak to, who you share silence with, who you let close enough to disturb your peace. And there will be moments when that peace feels fragile, when doubt creeps in, when loneliness knocks on your door disguised as old lovers, old friends, old habits, and you will have to decide again and again what matters more, being chosen or being free. Because one will always cost the other, and if you've made it this far, you already know the answer. You've already made the choice. You're just learning to trust it now, to stand by it when it gets uncomfortable, to remind yourself that discomfort is not danger, it's the terrain of transformation. This is the part nobody tells you about, that freedom feels lonely before it feels empowering, that self-respect feels like exile before it feels like clarity, that boundaries feel like loss before they feel like liberation. But Epicurus knew this. He lived it. He warned that most suffering comes not from solitude, but from trying to avoid it, from tying our happiness to what is unstable, unpredictable, external. And what is more unstable than the affections of a world that doesn't even know itself? You begin to see that love is not something you chase, it's something you recognize. And most of what you used to call love was just trauma bonding, pattern repetition, emotional bartering. I'll give you what you want if you make me feel like I matter. But now, you want something deeper. You're not interested in performances. You're not impressed by grand gestures. You're watching for inner peace, light confidence, for mutual stillness, and that makes things slower, rarer, more refined. So you walk differently now, with your energy tucked in, your presence sharp but soft, your eyes not searching, but seeing. You don't need to be seen to exist. You exist because you know. You know the cost of self-betrayal. You know the ache of living for others. You know the exhaustion of being the emotional support system for people who never once asked how you're really doing. And you're done. You're done being the backup plan, the option, the second choice. You are not a mirror for someone else's lack. You are not a stage for their self-discovery. You are not a placeholder for someone who hasn't done their inner work. And when you feel that temptation rise again, to go back, to fix, to explain, you pause, you breathe, you remember, and you return to yourself. Because now you understand what Epicurus meant when he said, "It is not the man who has too little, but the man who craves more that is poor," and craving external validation, attention, affection, admiration, that was poverty. Emotional poverty, spiritual poverty, the kind that made you trade your truth for a text back, that made you ignore red flags just to not feel invisible, that made you contort, apologize, diminish. But you're not that man anymore. You're full, not perfect, not finished, but full enough to stop begging. That fullness is the result of choosing solitude, of using it not as a hiding place, but as a forge. You've built something within you that can't be seduced by shallow connection anymore. You want soul, you want depth. You want energy that doesn't need to be earned, just recognized, and because you want it, you're willing to wait. You're willing to be misunderstood. You're willing to be alone. And here's the final paradox. The more you lean into that solitude, the more magnetic you become. Not because you're trying to be, but because there's nothing more attractive than a man who doesn't need to be. Your stillness speaks, your boundaries communicate, your energy draws without effort. And those who are not ready for that will say you're too distant, too difficult, too intense. Let them. You are no longer living in their emotional economy. You've created your own, one rooted in clarity, in inner freedom, in quiet power. And maybe love comes, maybe it doesn't. Maybe friendship deepens, maybe it fades. Maybe you walk alone for a while. Maybe you meet someone on the same road, walking with the same quiet resolve. Whatever happens, you remain. Because your identity is no longer up for auction. It's no longer shaped by who wants you or who doesn't. It's rooted in who you've chosen to become. So if you're watching this, and you're single, alone, unchosen, don't mourn, celebrate. Because what you're learning now is the kind of emotional self-sufficiency most people never touch. What you're becoming is not incomplete, it's indestructible. You're learning to live with yourself, to walk with yourself, to respect yourself so deeply that anyone who enters your life will have to rise to meet you. You are not waiting, you are arriving. Every day, every moment you choose silence over noise, clarity over chaos, truth over validation, you arrive, and that arrival, that's the beginning of real power.